Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In the last episode, we learned even more about the people in Angie McCartney's life. She was married, of course, to Jim McCartney, and having Paul as her stepson. And she got to meet all the other Beatles and other people in Paul's world. So let's see what she's up to today. Angie said in her early days of her marriage to Jim, she got to meet Ringo's mom and stepfather, Elsie and Harry Graves. She said they were lovely people. They would visit Rembrandt, where they would all have tea together. They talked about Liverpool in the old days before the Beatles turned everything upside down. Ringo bought his mother a lovely bungalow in Gate Acre on the outskirts of Liverpool. Angie and Jim would go and visit them. Harry loved to work in his garden, and they both lived a simple life. Harry and Jim always liked to talk about plants and gardening, and Angie said we women and little Ruth always found plenty to talk about. They weren't slaves to TV as people are today. Elsie told Angie of her early struggles as a single mother before she married Harry Graves, a dear, sweet, and kind man. She would sometimes be afraid to open the front door in case it was the rent man, so she would tell Richie to bend down and look under the gap at the bottom of the door to see if it was a pair of boots. If there were, it might be the dreaded rent man. Elsie said that since the Beatles' success, Richie gave her an allowance. Every time she received it, she would put 10 pounds into a post office savings account for Richie in case it all ever went away and he needed the money. That was a sweet mom thing to do. Angie said, bless her heart, if she only knew. She was so proud of him and never failed to cut out clippings from the papers and magazines and keep them in scrapbooks. Angie said that then again, as parents and step-parents, we're all proud of the Beatle Boys. Angie said that Rembrandt rocked from the years of 1964 to 1976. They had a lot of people hanging out at the house. Mike would come from time to time with various friends and hangers-on, and she said those moments never failed to entertain. Angie remembered one night when Jim was away in Mexico for his nephew's wedding. Angie and Mum in their dressing gowns went downstairs to investigate. They were surprised and horrified that two very tipsy girls with frying pans on the stove were burning the bacon while drinking wine. They offered to take over before the house burnt down. And there was one night they found Freddie Starr in the lounge making an appearance from behind velvet curtains. He was singing Falling in Love Again, and Trinity member Brian Auger was playing the piano. The following day, it was Ruth's 7th birthday, and she came home from school in the afternoon and went upstairs to find Rod Stewart asleep in her bed. Another one of Mike's memorable guests was Billy Connolly, and that was after Mike had married Angie Fishwick and moved into the Heswell Lower Village. There was a Christmas party at Rembrandt, and it was crowded. Billy decided to jump out of the upstairs window with a little plastic Batman parachute from a cereal packet. She said she didn't know how he didn't hurt himself, landing on the gravel below. And one time Mike brought Dusty Springfield and Madeline Bell to Rembrandt one night. Mike asked Angie to get some vodka for Dusty, and when they got home, they both sat under the grand piano in the living room. Angie said she was appalled when the glamorous Dusty Springfield whipped off her wig to reveal a flattened down and plain head of hair. She said that was a fun night. Now here's a really cute story called Christmas Cakes. In October 1965, Jim thought that he and Angie should start a new tradition, making Christmas cakes for the family. He and Mary, his former wife who died, had made them in the past. Angie said it was a dawning for her, stepping into a void left by his beloved Mary, the boy's mother, and they sat down to make a list of family members who should receive them. Jim, she thought, didn't realize how anxious she was about it. The first year, the recipients numbered 17. Jim had an old recipe, and she thought it came from a newspaper. They set to work with a list of ingredients, ordered from the local grocers, cart mills, and got to work. They had to buy a massive bowl, lots of utensils, sieves, grease-proof paper, and baking tins to fit each cake. It was a very time-consuming deal to make the mix: dried fruits, candy peel, raisins, brandy, dried currants, butter, brown sugar, flour, eggs, salt, nutmeg, allspice, nuts, and the grated zest of lemons and oranges, and, of course, the brandy. Angie was very nervous about the process, but with Jim's help, she became an expert at it, and it started to become easy. Ruth loved being a part of it, and Angie now realizes that Ruth got the cooking bug then. As they made them, they cooled and then prepped to be frozen in the big freezer chest they had in their garage. Then at the appropriate time, they were all hauled back into the kitchen at Rembrandt, defrosted, topped with marzipan, wrapped and frozen again until it was time for icing. She said she learned a lot about cake making that first year. Angie had trouble about icing, but Jim had it down pat. Then they finally put on the Christmassy decorations on top, sleds, Santa, silver balls, etc. Then they were wrapped up with colored cellophane paper and tied with ribbon, ready for Angie to make the rounds and deliver them to Aunt Mill, Auntie Jen, Bet and Mike, Ian and Jackie, Diane, Joe and Joan, and their kids, Edie, Jean and Ted, Kath and Reg, etc. Angie said what I was thinking. Knowing how people scoff and mock at fruitcakes, I wonder whether our gifts were a blessing or a cure, but of course, because they came from Uncle Jim, I guess I would never know. I hope they were enjoyed by all. This is me talking. I hope they were enjoyed by all because it sounded like a lot of work. Angie said it was a happy family occasion for her, Jim, and Ruth, and Angie said that she and Ruth carried this tradition on to this day. Now we have the time when Paul told Angie and Jim about the time the Beatles were in the Philippines. And this happened on August 1966, after their disastrous exit from the Philippines. Paul sat at the kitchen table and talked about the trip. He said the trip seemed to be cursed from the start. Paul said that when they first got there, they were driven around in an open-top vehicle, and Paul was giving them a thumbs-up sign to the cheering crowds. Their faces went from delight to hostility. Later, Paul learned that thumbs up in that country is equivalent to the middle finger in our world. Whoops. Then the incident happened when the Beatles weren't at the special luncheon hosted by Imelda Marcos. It was thought that the invitation was casual, not a command. Later, when Brian read the paper, he saw it was serious, and it was scheduled for the early morning, not 3 p.m., and so forth. So this wasn't on the official itinerary, and there was confusion. On that Monday morning, military officers came to escort the Beatles to the palace. They stated that the luncheon would be attended by hundreds of children of the aristocracy. Epstein wasn't going to allow anyone to intrude on the Beatles' downtime, so the men left, and then Brian got a call from the British ambassador's office about it. The TV news said that the kids started arriving at 10 a.m. and waited until 2 p.m. Then death threats started floating around. Brian gave an interview on TV saying that neither he or the boys had received any invitation. The transmission wasn't shown, so nobody heard his explanation. After the concert that night, the police escort was withdrawn, and it was scary. And the Beatles trying to get out of Manila had problems. Baggage handlers wouldn't help, and escalators were shut down. The roadies got the worst of it. Mal Evans was thrown to the ground and kicked, and Brian Epstein was hit in the face. It was horrible. They didn't get their passports back until the last minute. Paul played diplomat and did a radio interview apologizing for their failure to meet Imelda Marcos, saying they knew nothing of her lunch party. Angie said, "Good old Paul, always the one to pour oil on troubled waters." Now, Angie was going to speak about Yoko Ono. Angie said she first learned about Yoko from Paul. He came home to Rembrandt for rest and relaxation. He said that Yoko was an avant-garde Japanese artist that John was interested in, and it seemed odd to Angie and Jim. Yoko was born in Tokyo, February 1933. She was the eldest of 3 children. Her parents were Isu and Izoko, wealthy aristocrats. Her father was a frustrated pianist who worked in mathematics and economics and became head of a Japanese bank in San Francisco in 1935. Yoko stayed behind in Tokyo with her mother and didn't start to know him until she was 2 years old. It was said her father was a direct descendant of an emperor of Japan. Paul said that when Yoko was a kid, she would have to ask for an appointment to speak with her father. If he was displeased with her, she was made to kneel on rice. She later moved to America and attended school, and it was there that she became a bohemian. And of course, her parents didn't like that. She developed an artistic bent from being around writers, artists, musicians, etc. Angie said that she only met her once in an LA restaurant with her PR man, Elliot Mintz. Yoko sent Ruth a recipe for a celebrity cookbook that she was working on to raise funds for charity. Angie also hoped that Yoko and Julian had mended their relationship somewhat now, as life is really too short to hold grudges. Next, Angie talked about Brian Epstein. She thought he was an exceptional in every way. He was a great businessman and a courteous and mannerly young man. Brian had taken all the right steps in getting Jim to sign Paul's contract when the Beatles negotiations first began. Jim was impressed with Brian and his parents, Queenie and Harry. She said that her and Jim were shocked when he died on August 27th, 1967. She said that she, Jim, Ruth, had spent the day at Bangor University in North Wales, where the Beatles and a journalist who was named George Harrison were at, and he was working for the Liverpool Echo, and they were attending a seminar with a Maharishi yogi. They all had lunch in the canteen-like area at long wooden tables, and they had simple food, salad, water, bread, and fruit. As they got in their car to drive back to Heswell, Paul came out and stuck his head in the window to say goodbye. And while they were talking, the journalist, George, said to Paul, "Brian's on the phone. He wants to speak to you about tomorrow." So Paul went to take the call. It must have been 2:30 p.m., so Brian was alive and well then. Angie said it was a bank holiday weekend and traffic was heavy, and they stopped for a bite of lunch and then let their little Scotty dog have a run and a wee-wee. Then they got to the front door of the Rembrandt. The phone was ringing. It was Louise Harrison, George's mom. She said that Brian had committed suicide, or that it might even have been murder. She had heard something on Radio Caroline, the pirate radio station. Angie said that they were in complete shock. Angie thought it must have been an accidental overdose, because Brian had just spoken to Paul to say he would join them the next day. Angie said his death left a void in so many lives. The Beatles didn't attend the actual Liverpool funeral out of respect for Brian's parents, because if they had been there, the Beatles that is, it would have been a media circus. A few weeks later, on October 17th, all four Beatles attended a memorial for Epstein at the New London Synagogue in St. John's Wood, near Abbey Road Studios. It was officiated by Rabbi Louis Jacobs. Angie said she still has a program of it as a memento of a very sad day. There were a lot of Brian's friends there, families and clients. Mourners included Cilla Black, Gary Marsden, Billy J. Kramer, the Beatles, and their ladies. Angie also saw Lulu that day. She wore hot pants with suspenders holding them up. Angie said that history seemed to have downplayed Brian's role in the Beatles' success, but to those of us who were there and in the know, none of it would have been remotely possible without Brian Epstein's participation. She said, "Godspeed, Brian, Godspeed, and Mazel Tov." Angie said when Ruth was 7, she broke her leg. It was the day before she was about to appear in a dancing school presentation. She was out with a school friend and her mother at West Kirby Beach, climbed a wall, and fell. The mother of the friend had her taken by ambulance to Birkenhead Children's Hospital. The hospital told the local police department about Ruth, and a policeman went to Rembrandt. He told them about Ruth, and they went as quick as possible to the hospital. She was allowed home by nightfall. Paul came up from London, seeing how sad she looked on the couch, and he wrote on the back of a ciggy packet, "Can I buy her a puppy?" Angie asked Jim, and he said yes. The two of them went to a kennel and came home with Hamish, a darling and feisty black Scotty. He used to snag spiders and keep them warm under his chin until he was ready to eat them. Angie said in 1967, she and Jim attended the London premiere of How I Won the War, which John Lennon was in. It was a poke at war. After the performance, they were all invited to Cilla Black in Bobby Willis's apartment in Portland Place. They got out of the limos to enter the buildings, and a drunk guy in a top hat, white tie and tails, came up to John and asked, "Aren't you one of those Beatle chappies?" And John nodded yes, and he put a notebook and pen in John's hand and said, "Then give me your autograph. It's for my daughter. I can't stand you myself." And John responded, "Well, F off then." When they got to the elevator to go up to Cilla and Bobby's flat, Mama Cass was in there too. She had recently been apprehended at Heathrow Airport and accused of taking a blanket from her hotel. Paul stunned everyone by saying, "Hi there, blanket thief." She saw the humor in it and laughed it off. Angie said that her husband, Gentleman Jim, was mortified. Louise Harrison, George's sister, Angie met at one of the Beatles premieres, and they liked each other right away. They have the same sense of humor, the same background, upbringing, work ethic, etc. She lived in the States for many years and was always a big champion for the Beatles before they hit it big in America. She was a radio host and introduced the boys' music to local stations. She contacted Brian Epstein and asked him to send her some copies of their records to spread the word. She remained loyal to George and his memory and his music. Angie said that when Louise was 80, she started to write a book because she got tired of people writing rubbish and they didn't really know George. She also kept busy with a tribute band named Liverpool Legends. She hosted a CD called Fab Fan Memories, comprised of contributors from fans with their memories of not only George but all the Beatles. And this was great news. It was nominated for a Grammy in 2012, but it was up against the legendary Betty White, and it didn't win. Angie said her mother Edie was staying with them at Rembrandt in early 1968, recovering from an illness. Paul got home late one night and sat on the end of her bed and asked her, "Can you sleep okay, Edie?" And she said, "Well, on and off, but when I'm awake I always love listening to the blackbird that sings just outside my bedroom window." Paul went downstairs and got Brother Mike's big old tape recorder, and he brought it up, sat with Angie's mom quietly until the bird started his nightly concert. Paul recorded it and took the tape away, and then he did an edit on it. A little later he went into the studio and recorded a blackbird. Before he started to sing, he said, "This one's called Blackbird, dedicated to Edie." Angie said she still has the original tape of Paul saying that, and whenever she hears the song, Angie said, "I feel proud that it was dedicated to my mom." So I'm going to stop the video here. We learned about how kind Ringo was to his mom and his stepdad, buying them a house. And I loved her story about the Christmas cakes. It sounded like it took a lot of time and effort, and I really hope everyone enjoyed receiving one. Fruitcake can get a bad rap. And then we hear about Angie talking about the Philippines when Paul was there and how horrible the Beatles had it there. And then we also heard about more famous people she met along the way. Then we found out how the song Blackbird came about. Her mother got the idea going, and that was really neat to find out. And I hope everybody enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would really help my channel out. And I wish everybody a good day. Tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.